July 4, 1944, Camp Forrest, Tennessee. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly on the red clay of Tennessee as the scent of cinnamon and baked apples drifted across the prisoner of war compound. In the sweltering heat of an American Independence Day, ovens in the camp kitchen worked overtime, producing something that would shatter the worldview of 8,000 German prisoners more effectively than any Allied propaganda campaign. Fresh apple pie. The golden crusts emerged from industrial ovens at precisely 1400 hours, their flaky surfaces glistening with egg wash and sugar crystals that caught the light like tiny diamonds. For Unteroffizier Wilhelm Brenner, standing in formation outside Compound C, the aroma carried impossible memories of his grandmother's kitchen in Bavaria, of peacetime celebrations that seemed to belong to another century, another world entirely. The steam rising from countless pie tins created small mirages in the summer heat, wavering phantoms that seemed to mock everything these men had been taught about their captors. According to the gospel of National Socialism, Americans were a soft, mongrel race grown weak on luxury and decadence, a people who would crumble at the first taste of real hardship. Yet here, in the midst of global warfare that had consumed entire continents, these supposedly degenerate Democrats were serving their enemies dessert. Not just any dessert, but pie made with real sugar, genuine spices, and fruit so fresh it might have been picked that very morning. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. These were not the emergency rations of a struggling nation, not the ersatz substitutes that had become the hallmark of wartime Germany. This was abundance expressed in pastry form, a casual demonstration of productive capacity that rendered Nazi racial theory absurd with every fragrant bite. The pie represented everything the prisoners had been conditioned to despise about American society. Yet its very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions upon which their entire worldview had been constructed. The story of German prisoners of war in American camps represents one of the most remarkable chapters in the broader narrative of ideological transformation during World War II. By the summer of 1944, the United States housed over 371,000 Axis prisoners, the vast majority captured during the campaigns in North Africa, Sicily, and the early stages of the Italian offensive. These men arrived on American shores carrying not just the physical scars of battle, but the psychological armor of 12 years of Nazi indoctrination that had prepared them for anything except what they actually encountered. A democratic society so confident in its values and so abundant in its resources that it could afford to treat its enemies with unprecedented generosity. Camp Forrest, established in 1940 on 75,000 acres of rolling Tennessee hills, had originally served as a training facility for American troops destined for the European theater. By 1943, it had been converted into one of the largest prisoner of war installations in the American South, housing Germans from every branch of the Wehrmacht. The camp population included Afrika Korps veterans who had fought under Rommel in the desert campaigns, paratroopers from the bitter fighting in Italy, U-boat crews pulled from the Atlantic, and increasingly, young conscripts barely out of their teens who represented the final, desperate mobilizations of a Reich already beginning its terminal decline. What united all these prisoners was their complete unpreparedness for American abundance. The pie served on that July 4, 1944, was not an exception but part of a systematic demonstration of American productive capacity that had been transforming prisoner attitudes since the first German POWs arrived on U.S. soil. The daily menu at Camp Forrest included not just adequate nutrition, but genuine luxuries that most of these men had not tasted since before the war began. Fresh meat, white bread, real coffee, dairy products, and yes, desserts that would have been considered extravagant even in peacetime Germany. The Independence Day pie service represented something more than mere celebration. It was a carefully orchestrated demonstration of American values translated into culinary terms. The decision to serve pie to German prisoners on the nation's birthday was made by Camp Commandant Colonel Robert Hayes, a career officer who understood that the treatment of prisoners was as much about winning the peace as managing the war. Hayes had studied the reports from other prisoner of war camps and recognized that generous treatment was accomplishing what years of counter-propaganda had failed to achieve. The voluntary abandonment of Nazi ideology by men who had once been its most dedicated adherents. The pie itself was a masterpiece of American industrial efficiency, adapted to culinary purposes. The camp's mess operations, overseen by Master Sergeant Tony Marchetti, an Italian-American whose family had immigrated to New York in 1922, represented a logistical achievement that dwarfed anything the German military had accomplished at the height of its power. Each day, the Camp Forrest kitchens processed 2 tons of flour, 1,500 pounds of sugar, 800 pounds of butter, and massive quantities of fresh fruit shipped in from orchards across the American South and Midwest. The apple pie served on July 4th required 240 pounds of fresh apples, trucked in from Virginia orchards where German prisoners working in agricultural details had themselves helped with the harvest. The irony was not lost on men like Brenner, who had spent the morning picking the very fruit that would appear on his plate that afternoon, transformed by American abundance into something that transcended mere sustenance and became a symbol of everything he had been taught to reject about democratic society. For committed Nazis like Oberscharführer Kurt Dietrich, a former SS officer who had arrived at Camp Forrest in May 1944, following his capture during the retreat from Rome. The pie represented a psychological warfare campaign of unprecedented sophistication. Dietrich had volunteered for indoctrination duties within the camp, conducting clandestine evening meetings where he attempted to maintain Nazi ideological purity among the prisoner population. His message was consistent and compelling. American generosity was a trap, designed to soften German resolve and corrupt Aryan racial consciousness. "They give us pie while German children starve," he told his followers during secret gatherings in the camp library. "This is not kindness but cruelty, not strength but weakness. They seek to make us forget our duty to the fatherland by filling our stomachs with their decadent luxury. A true German finds strength in sacrifice and purity in want." His words carried the authority of years of ideological training and the passionate conviction of a man who had built his entire identity around Nazi racial theory. But Dietrich's influence began to wane. As the summer progressed and the pie kept coming, not just on holidays but regularly, predictably, as part of a meal service that defied everything Nazi propaganda had taught about American society. The reliability of this abundance began to work changes in the prisoners that no amount of ideological training could counter. They observed that American guards ate the same food, that camp personnel showed no signs of the moral decay that propaganda had promised would characterize a mongrel democracy grown soft on luxury. The transformation was most visible in younger prisoners like 19-year-old Gefreiter Hans Kruger, who had been drafted into the Wehrmacht directly from his apprenticeship as a pastry chef in Hamburg. Kruger had arrived at Camp Forrest in June 1944, wounded during the fighting in Normandy and carrying with him the absolute certainty that democratic capitalism was a parasitic system destined for inevitable collapse. His first encounter with American pie shattered that certainty in ways that weeks of interrogation could never have accomplished. Kruger's expertise as a professional baker allowed him to analyze the pie with technical precision that other prisoners lacked. He could identify the quality of the flour, the purity of the sugar, the freshness of the spices, the skill required to achieve such consistent results across thousands of individual servings. More importantly, he began to understand that this level of production required not just raw materials, but also a social and economic system, sophisticated enough to organize and distribute those resources with remarkable efficiency. "The crust was perfect," he confided to the camp chaplain during one of their regular conversations. "Not just adequate, not merely sufficient, but genuinely excellent. The apples were fresh, the spices were pure, the technique was flawless." I realized that not only did these Americans have access to the finest ingredients in the midst of global war, but they possessed the industrial capacity and technical skill to transform those ingredients into something that would have been considered a luxury in the best restaurants of Berlin. The pie became a gateway to larger questions about the nature of American society and the war itself. If the Americans could produce such abundance for their prisoners, what did that suggest about their capacity to sustain their own population and military forces? If they could afford to give their finest ingredients to enemy soldiers, what did that reveal about their overall economic strength and social organization? These questions began to gnaw at the ideological foundations that had sustained these men through years of warfare and sacrifice. The daily routine of meal service also exposed the prisoners to aspects of American democratic culture that their Nazi indoctrination had not prepared them to understand. The mess sergeants who served their food were not the brutal overseers that propaganda had promised, but ordinary American men performing their duties with professional competence and casual friendliness. Many were immigrants themselves or the children of immigrants, Italian, Irish, Polish, Jewish Americans, whose very existence in positions of responsibility contradicted fundamental Nazi assumptions about racial hierarchy and democratic society. Sergeant Marchetti, whose family had fled Mussolini's Italy, took particular pride in the quality of the desserts his kitchen produced. For him, serving excellent pie to German prisoners was not just a matter of following Geneva Convention requirements, but a demonstration of the values that had drawn his family to America in the first place. My Nonna always said that you judge a society by how it treats those who cannot defend themselves, he told a visiting War Department official. These men were our enemies last month, but today they are human beings in our care. That's what makes us different from them. This casual humanitarianism, expressed through the simple act of ensuring that prisoners received quality dessert with their meals, began to work profound changes in men who had been taught that such sentiments were evidence of racial weakness and moral decay. The pie became a daily reminder that their fundamental assumptions about American society might be wrong, that the system they had been fighting to destroy might actually represent something worthy of respect, even admiration. The psychological impact was cumulative and relentless. By August 1944, Dietrich's evening indoctrination sessions, once attended by hundreds of prisoners eager to maintain their ideological purity, attracted audiences of fewer than 50 men. His message of racial superiority and inevitable German victory began to sound increasingly hollow in the face of daily evidence of American abundance and genuine human decency. The pie that appeared regularly on prisoner tables became a symbol of everything his ideology could not explain or explain away. The transformation accelerated with the arrival of new prisoners following the breakout from the Normandy beachhead and the collapse of German resistance in France. These men brought with them fresh reports of American military effectiveness, accounts of well-fed, well-equipped troops advancing with apparent inexhaustible supplies of ammunition, fuel, and equipment. The contrast with their own experience of chronic shortages, ersatz materials, and increasingly desperate improvisations could not have been more stark. Obergefreiter Brenner found himself appointed to a prisoner committee responsible for liaising with camp administration on matters of daily life. The position gave him access to American officers and civilian personnel that allowed him to observe the functioning of democratic society at close quarters. What he discovered challenged everything he had been taught about the nature of free government and racial democracy. The Americans discussed problems openly, argued among themselves about solutions, and made decisions based on what seemed to work best rather than what conformed to ideological purity, he wrote in a secret diary that would later be donated to the National Archives. Their officers were not distant figures demanding blind obedience, but men who explained their reasoning and listened to suggestions from subordinates. Even we prisoners were consulted about matters affecting our daily lives. This was not the chaos and weakness that our propaganda had promised, but a different kind of strength entirely. The pie served as a constant reminder of this strength. Every time it appeared on the mess hall tables, it represented the capacity of democratic society to maintain abundance and generosity, even under the extreme pressures of global warfare. Nazi ideology had taught that democracies were inherently weak because they valued individual comfort over collective sacrifice. But the evidence before their eyes suggested something entirely different. That a society based on individual freedom might actually be more productive, more efficient, and ultimately stronger than one based on coercion and racial hierarchy. The autumn of 1944 brought news of German military disasters on both the eastern and western fronts, and with it, a final crisis of faith for the remaining ideological holdouts among the Camp Forrest prisoner population. As reports filtered in, of the failure of the Ardennes offensive and the inexorable advance of Allied armies toward the German homeland, the evening pie service took on an almost sacramental significance. Men who had once dismissed American generosity as weakness now understood it as evidence of a moral and social system that could remain humane even toward its enemies. The collapse of organized resistance to re-education efforts came gradually, then suddenly. Dietrich's final indoctrination meeting, held in November 1944, attracted fewer than a dozen followers. The pie that appeared on tables that evening was consumed by men for whom it had become not a symbol of enemy decadence, but evidence of democratic strength and human possibility. 3 days later, Dietrich voluntarily ended his resistance activities and requested enrollment in the camp's educational programs. "I spent months telling these men that American abundance was a sign of moral weakness," he confided to camp psychologist Dr. Margaret Stevens. "But I finally understood that I was wrong. The pie we ate every few days was not evidence of decadence but of strength, not proof of weakness but demonstration of a society so confident in its values and so productive in its capabilities that it could afford to be generous even to those who had sought its destruction." The re-education programs that followed found fertile ground among prisoners whose ideological certainties had already been undermined by months of American generosity, expressed in countless small ways, from the quality of their medical care to the freshness of their food, to the simple fact that dessert appeared regularly on their tables. Classes in democratic theory, American history, and constitutional government attracted enthusiastic audiences of men who had come to understand that their fundamental assumptions about the nature of free society had been profoundly mistaken. Kruger enrolled in every available educational program, driven by intellectual hunger that matched his professional appreciation for American culinary abundance. He studied the Constitution, the Bill of Rights, the federal system, and the economic principles that had made such prosperity possible in the midst of global war. His technical expertise as a baker allowed him to appreciate not just the quality of American food production, but the sophisticated industrial and logistical systems required to sustain such abundance across a continental nation, simultaneously fighting on multiple fronts around the world. The pie was just the beginning, he would write years later to Dr. Stevens. It was the first crack in a wall of lies that had been built around us since childhood. Once that wall began to crumble, we could see clearly for the first time in our lives. We saw that democracy was not weakness but strength, that abundance was not decadence but the natural result of human freedom, and that treating your enemies with dignity was not foolishness but the deepest kind of wisdom. The impact of the Camp Forrest experience extended far beyond the individual prisoners who lived through it. As these men were eventually repatriated to Germany between 1946 and 1948, they became ambassadors for democratic values in a society struggling to rebuild itself after the collapse of Nazi totalitarianism. The memory of regular dessert service in an American prisoner of war camp became a powerful argument for the adoption of democratic institutions and free market economics in the emerging federal republic. Dr. Stevens's comprehensive study of attitude change among German prisoners, published by the War Department in 1947, documented the transformation in remarkable detail. The regular service of high-quality food, including desserts that would have been considered luxurious in wartime Germany, accomplished strategic objectives that conventional propaganda could never have achieved, she wrote. By demonstrating American values through daily practice, rather than political rhetoric, we created a generation of Germans who understood democracy not as an abstract theory, but as a lived experience of abundance, dignity, and human possibility. The pie that appeared on Camp Forrest tables between 1943 and 1947 represented more than dessert. It embodied the fundamental difference between a society based on human freedom and one founded on racial coercion. In Nazi Germany, even basic foods had become weapons of political control, distributed according to racial hierarchy and ideological loyalty. In America, even enemy prisoners received quality desserts prepared with genuine care and served without regard to their political beliefs or military resistance. The transformation of German prisoners at Camp Forrest demonstrated the power of abundance as an instrument of ideological change. Where years of propaganda and coercion had failed to create genuine converts to Nazi ideology, American pie succeeded in opening minds and changing hearts. The prisoners learned that democracy was not chaos but ordered freedom, that generosity was not naivety but enlightened strength, and that a society based on individual liberty could achieve levels of prosperity and abundance that totalitarian systems could only dream of matching. The lessons of Camp Forrest echoed through the decades that followed as both a model for prisoner treatment and a demonstration of soft power at its most effective. The men who returned to Germany carrying memories of American abundance became leaders in the Reconstruction effort, advocates for democratic institutions and living testimonies to the possibility of ideological transformation. The pie they had eaten as prisoners of war became a symbol of everything they had fought against, only to discover that it represented everything they had actually been seeking. The promise that human beings, given freedom and opportunity, could create societies of unprecedented prosperity and generosity. When Wilhelm Brenner finally departed Camp Forrest in March 1947, he carried with him a small notebook filled with recipes copied from Sergeant Marchetti, including the formula for the apple pie that had helped transform his understanding of human possibility. Upon his return to Bavaria, he opened a small bakery specializing in American-style desserts, serving pie to customers who marveled at the abundance and quality that democratic society had made possible. The circle was complete. The pie that had once symbolized enemy decadence had become a celebration of human freedom and the endless possibilities it created. The steam still rises from bakery ovens across America each day, carrying with it the same promise of abundance that once transformed the hearts and minds of enemy soldiers and helped win a war not just on the battlefield, but in the deeper realm of human consciousness where true victory is always ultimately decided. In the end, it was not superior firepower or strategic brilliance alone that triumphed, but the quiet revelation that a free society could produce such abundance that it could afford to serve pie to its enemies, and in doing so, demonstrate the power of human dignity, democratic values, and the endless possibilities that emerge when people are free to pursue their own happiness in their own way.